May the words of my mouth and the meditation of all our hearts be acceptable to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. I am only a boy. Jeremiah chapter 1, part of the 6th verse. I am only a boy. In my early days as a priest, a young couple that I knew randomly and surprisingly walked into my office at the church seeking help with their marriage. The young lady, sadly and unfortunately, professed that she was no longer in love with her husband and wanted a divorce. Her husband, of course, sat across from me, washed away in tears. And as I saw him in that state, suddenly I was gripped with an overwhelming sense of inadequacy. You see, seminary had not trained me for this. How do you handle and help someone in pain? I sat across from them baffled, inexperienced and with mouth partially agape. I was totally unprepared and seemingly unable to offer any sage advice. What could I say? What could I do? Where was I to even begin? How do I even deal with this situation? You see, I knew next to nothing about pre- or post-marital counseling or how to alleviate the stress caused by troubling issues that burden people's day-to-day lives. So what happened to their marriage as a result of my inexperienced counsel? Oh, it was a learning experience, and one you'll find out about at the end of the sermon. Some days, in the privacy of my inner thoughts, I need to be assured that the work I've been called to will not be in vain. That this is what God has truly called me to do. Ever had one of those days? Perhaps we all have. You see, there are days that I grasp for the reassurance of ministry in this ministry. Because like many Christians and many in Christian ministry, there are days I feel hopelessly and helplessly inadequate, unable to perform the tasks at hand. There were days when I made mistakes, lots of mistakes, and days when my judgment as a priest was impaired by inexperience and youthful optimism, perhaps impetuosity and impatience. The desire for things to happen more quickly than they actually do in real life. So what gives us the assurance that we are more than conquerors? What gives us the assurance that we can do this ministry no matter how difficult, no matter our inadequacies? And where do you find assurance when called by God to perform tasks and ministries that seem overwhelming or burdensome or so very hard to do? How do you cope, dear friends? Jeremiah was called to be a prophet when his country hit rock bottom. The people had turned away from God, as you know, and were given to lawlessness and corruption. So God was about to speak to their situation, and for that he called the boy Jeremiah. Jeremiah responds by protesting and sighing over his inadequacy with the task. If we read the Greek, it indicates that Jeremiah was overwhelmed. Not only did he feel incompetent or lacking in ability, but he was also concerned about people's reaction and their response. And aren't we all at some point in the work we do? What will others say? What will my boss say? How will this all pan out? You see, Jeremiah knew that Israel was a difficult people. And we know that. They complained and complained 40 years in the wilderness, complaining and complaining and complaining. And so surely they would tear him to pieces. He was concerned. And so human of Jeremiah, he began to make excuses. I do not know how to speak, God. I remember when I asked somebody to lead a group, and they said to me, I don't know how to speak. And in my mind, I thought, as much as you talk. But I digress. Jeremiah also said, I am only a boy. Jeremiah thought that to be a spokesman for God required a certain gravitas, the kind of maturity and seriousness that comes with age. But not so for God. And you know, as I read this text, I realized that there is not one of us who do not struggle with the call of God in our lives. My guess is that most, if not all of us, tread water to keep our sense of adequacy afloat. And so we use excuses. Lord, I'm too young. I'm too old. Sorry, I've got plans. It's just not in the cards. Familiar with any of those excuses? Yes. We all wrestle with reluctance, and we often resist the call that God places on our lives, whether it's the call to a specialized ministry, such as the leader of a stewardship, or to be a priest, or the fundamental call to be a Christian all day and every day. Yeah, a call that may sometimes require us to be the bigger person, to choose kind words rather than use choice words and unbecoming signs with our hands, to love our spouses or children or family even when they are not particularly lovable, the call to forgive the seemingly unforgivable. I wonder if you know what it is to find yourself overwhelmed or incapable of doing these tasks. If you don't believe me, let's try a simple exercise. Think of the last time that you were really, really angry. Angry with somebody. And Mimi turns away from Frank. The last time you were really angry. And I asked a child that this morning, Hannah, and she said, I was angry like that yesterday. And I said, could you calm down in that moment? Could you think nicely about the person in that moment? Did you want to apologize in that moment? Did you even want to forgive in that moment? And she said, no. And how true. When we are angry, it's hard to do what God calls us to do. Love the person and talk to the person and treat the person the way God calls us to. Rather, we distance ourselves, we shun the person, or we say one or two things that may be very hurtful. And I know it's not only me that do that here. But we all struggle with feeling inadequate because sometimes we focus on the wrong credentials. We often look at our humanity, at our strength, but not the power and the strength of God. You see, that was the problem in the gospel today. Jesus was rejected because they only saw his human ability. Is not this Joseph's son? Is not this the carpenter's son? And so they wrestled with his ability. We wrestle with inadequacy because we sometimes worry about what others will think or say. We worry about people's disapproval or disappointment. Whenever we place what others think before God, guess what? We will always struggle. And so Peter gives us this sobering advice in the book of Acts, chapter 5 and verse 29. We must obey God rather than human beings. We struggle with inadequacy because we live with the ghost that we might fail. You see, the fear of failure is nothing new to this generation. It is something that characterizes the history of the Bible. From Moses to Joshua and from Peter to young Timothy, we see this fear of failure. So much so that Timothy is urged, God has not given you a spirit of fear or timidity, but of power and of courage and of a sound mind. And so often we live with this fear that God's plan will not ultimately fail. And so yesterday, after I returned home from a night out from Bible study, right? After I returned home and I sat in my lazy boy and I was watching the television. And headline after headline came. I began to wonder about this ministry and this life. 28-year-old young man, graduated from Penn State, drops down dead during basketball game, undetected heart problem. Governor will not resign, accused of racist remarks. 2 teenagers killed in crash, drunk driving while heading to school. Young man, 28 years later, finally discovered and locked up for raping somebody 28 years ago. And it kept pouring in and pouring in and pouring in. And finally I had to get up and take a breather. I began to wonder, is my ministry in vain? What impact are we having, God? And I turned to the text for today. And there I received some reassurance, knowing that I would be preaching today. As God would later remind Jeremiah, I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper and for good. That's what I remembered thinking some years later. Because on the days following my ordination, I wondered if I could do this ministry. I said, Lord, I really don't know if I could write a sermon every week, I said, once a month, but every week? And well, now in my 18th year, I'm still here. And as the author says, but for the grace of God, go I. Or as the Bible puts it in 2 Corinthians 15:10, his grace was not without effect on me. I do what I do, and I'm able to do what I do only because of the grace of God. And so when you are feeling helpless and overwhelmed, when you're feeling inadequate, may you remember Paul's words, of which I like the King James Version. But we have this treasure in earthen vessels, that the excellency of the power may be of God and not of us. The transcendent power, as one version says, belongs to God and not to you. St. Paul says, it's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. When Jeremiah turns to God, therefore, with his own limitedness and human fragility, God gives him a triple assurance that we are not meant to miss. He said to Jeremiah, I formed you. I knew you. I consecrated you. I appointed you. God assured him of his awareness and his grace, and that he is the creator, the maker of all humankind. Then he said, I am with you to deliver you. He not only assured him of his presence, he assured him of the result, that ultimately he is Alpha and Omega. God's always in control. And then he said to him, I have put my words in your mouth, the assurance of his power and knowledge and wisdom and strength. We do not do this ministry on our own. Therefore, says Paul, do not lose heart. Although you and I are not Jeremiah, dear friends, God still gives us that triple assurance. His grace is sufficient. Remember God's words, you did not choose me, I chose you. And so in the crises of my life and in my inadequacies, I'm called to remember that. You did not choose me. I chose you. I formed you. See, that's the word that came to me when I initially gave counsel to that young couple who sought out my help. After a brief prayer inwardly and then one outwardly with them, I was able to share, to my surprise, biblical and practical wisdom with that couple. And thankfully, by the grace of God, after 10 weeks of meeting with them on a weekly basis, something stuck. And not only did they remain together, but they went on to have another child. And now, 18 years later, they seem to be more in love than ever. But I'm all too aware that it was nothing I did or nothing I said. It was by the power and grace of God. I also realized that it was then that, like Timothy, I would have to study to show myself approved. That I would have to be in prayer and remain connected to God. That He is the vine, I am a branch, I am a vessel, I am a conduit through whom He works. And I must always remain humble so that He could use me. And that's partly why I got training in psychotherapy too. Because people need help beyond mere theological training. So when you are in a struggle, when you find yourself overwhelmed, remember that Christ is our sure foundation. Remember that God clothes us from on high. He knows us as He told Jeremiah. And the word know in Hebrew, yada, suggests an intimate kind of knowing and a deep relationship that comes with commitment. A kind of commitment that says, I will never leave you nor forsake you. Always remember, God's with you. And sometimes, as that wonderful poem reminds us, when you only see 2 footprints in the sand, know that that's when God is carrying you. Keep that in mind. His grace is sufficient. And when we sometimes forget that, as we go about life, remember His promises, that no weapon formed against us will prosper. And as we live into that promise, may you also take into consideration several quick and practical steps offered to us by Hilary Jacobs Hendel. She is a well-known social worker who talks a lot about shame and inadequacy. She says we can do 4 basic things. 1, we can remind ourselves again and again that the feeling of inadequacy, the feeling that I'm not good enough, is something that's learned. It's not something we are born with. It comes through experiences. It's not an objective fact, even when it feels viscerally true. Remind yourself, if I learn this, I can unlearn it. 2, we can connect to that part of us that feels bad and offer it compassion like we would do for our children or partners or colleagues or friends. Take that little boy or that little girl inside of you that says, I am not good enough, I am inadequate, and hug that child and says, you are loved. You are worthy. You are good enough. You are wonderfully and fearfully made. 3, and studies have proven this to be true. We can stand in a power pose 2 to 3 times a day. And so midway through college or whenever I'm going into a meeting in which I feel intimidated, I stand in my power pose and I say, bring it on, Bishop. Sorry. No, bring it on. The power pose gives us a sense that we are more than conquerors. We are more than adequate. And it helps us to feel stronger and more confident. And finally, we can remember this helpful phrase: compare and despair. Compare and despair. When you catch yourself making comparison to others, in other words, stop. Stop. It doesn't help, and it only hurts by fueling feelings and thoughts of not enough. The more we look around, the more we will feel inadequate. Focus on who God has called us to be. And remember, you are good enough. Amen.